Today, we think of war as something modern. Armies, cities, borders, and weapons made of steel. But the truth is, the first battlefield wasn't made of metal or stone walls. It was mud, firelight, and silence. 13,000 years ago, on the banks of an ancient African river, a small group of hunter-gatherers went to sleep under the stars. By morning, almost all of them were dead. The evidence lay buried for thousands of years until scientists uncovered dozens of shattered skulls, splintered bones, and broken weapons frozen in the mud. These weren't accidents or animal attacks. This was an ambush, a coordinated strike carried out with precision and intent. The victims never stood a chance. It was the earliest organized war we've ever found, a Stone Age massacre that turned a quiet riverside camp into the first known battlefield in human history. And yet, this discovery isn't just about how people died. It's about how violence shaped the world that came after, how fear built the first alliances, how revenge forged the first rules, and how a single night of chaos helped invent everything we now call civilization. If you're listening to this while falling asleep, that's exactly why I make these. So, subscribe maybe, and tell me where you are and what time it is. I read the comments, and it's always surreal. People in Tokyo at sunrise, London at midnight, Los Angeles half awake, all of us connected, listening to the ghosts of our ancestors who fought by the river under a sky full of broken stars. You know that feeling when the night feels too quiet, like the air itself is holding its breath before something terrible happens. That's what it must have felt like on the banks of a forgotten river nearly 12,000 years ago. A small camp of early humans huddled near their fires, their shadows stretching against the cave walls, their laughter carried softly through the reeds. They had no idea they were living through their final night. The stars above were bright and cold, scattered across the black sky like chipped flint. The river shimmered faintly in the moonlight, a silver ribbon twisting through the dark. Children slept beside their parents. The hunters were tired from a long day of fishing. It should have been peaceful, but somewhere beyond the tree line, other eyes were watching. Dozens of them, silent, focused, waiting. These were not strangers in the modern sense. They were the same kind of people. They spoke similar words, used the same tools, hunted the same game. But something had changed between them. Maybe it was hunger, maybe revenge, maybe the oldest reason of all, fear of losing what little they had. The darkness moved, a soft splash, a snapped reed. The dogs pricked their ears, but no one stirred. The watchers crept closer, feet sinking into the wet earth, gripping stone clubs and spears hardened by fire. They had studied this camp for days, learning who stood watch, when the fires burned low, how the wind carried sound. Tonight everything aligned. The moon was bright enough to see, but not enough to reveal. The air was still, perfect for an ambush. The leader of the attackers raised his hand, signaling to the others. He could hear the faint crackle of embers, the slow rhythm of sleeping breaths. His heart pounded like a drum in his chest, not from fear, but from focus. He had lost kin to this camp before. Tonight he would take his revenge. The first blow came without warning. A single scream split the night, followed by chaos. Stones flew through the air, spears flashed in the firelight. The camp erupted as people stumbled awake, shouting, grabbing children, trying to make sense of what was happening. But it was already too late. The attackers rushed in from every side, their shadows merging with the smoke. The sound of stone on bone echoed across the riverbank. Bodies fell, fires scattered sparks into the air. In the confusion, the river glittered red. When the sun rose, the camp was silent. The fires had gone out. Smoke hung low over the wreckage. Broken tools lay scattered among footprints and blood. Dozens were dead, their skulls cracked. Their lives ended in a single coordinated attack that would remain hidden beneath the silt for thousands of years. What happened that night wasn't just violence. It was a message. The first organized act of war in human history, written not in words, but in shattered bone. It started with a storm. Heavy rain pounding on cracked soil in a dry valley of northern Africa. The kind of rain that reshapes land overnight. When it finally stopped, a local herder walking along the riverbank saw something strange poking out from the mud. At first he thought it was a rock, pale and smooth, but as he brushed away the silt, the shape beneath became clear. A skull, then another, then another. He called the authorities, and soon a team of archaeologists arrived, boots sinking into the wet earth, cameras clicking as they realized what they were looking at. It wasn't a burial, it was a massacre. The bones lay scattered, tangled, some face down, some staring blankly toward the sun. Every skull told a story of violence. Deep fractures radiated across the crowns, perfect circles where stone points had entered. One skull had a spear tip still lodged inside, frozen in time. Others showed cracks from clubs, jawbones shattered, forearms snapped where someone had tried to block a blow. This wasn't ritual, this wasn't an accident. It was deliberate, fast, and coordinated. Forensic specialists were brought in. They worked slowly, measuring, photographing, cataloguing each fragment before the sun dried the clay and made the bones brittle. Drones mapped the site from above, revealing that the skeletons formed a cluster, as if they had fallen together, struck down in the same moment. The sediments around them told their own story. Layers of ash and river mud suggested a camp near water, a place people had returned to over and over until one night it became a grave. The dating shocked everyone. Roughly 12,000 years old, long before the rise of farming, cities, or metal weapons. This was the Stone Age, a time we often imagine as peaceful bands of hunter-gatherers living in harmony with nature. Yet here was proof that even then, humans were capable of organized killing. The site was sealed and protected. Tents rose over the skeletons to shield them from the wind. Scientists worked in silence, aware that each brushstroke peeled back not just dirt, but history itself. One of them, a young researcher from Nairobi, described it best. He said it felt like standing at the edge of the first battlefield. Every mark, every fracture was a clue to how it began, when survival turned into strategy and fear became a weapon. As the bones were lifted from the ground and packed for study, something unexpected emerged. Many of the victims were women and children. There was no sign of ritual burial, no attempt to cover the dead. It was as if the attackers had struck and vanished before dawn. The rain that revealed them had also preserved their story. In the quiet of the excavation tent, surrounded by trays of skulls and shattered tools, one truth became clear. Long before empires and armies, war was already written into our bones. When scientists first cleaned the skulls, they thought time itself had cracked them. But under the lab lights, the fractures told another story. They weren't the slow breaks of decay or pressure from soil. They were sharp, violent, and fresh at the moment of death. Each skull became a witness, each fracture line a frozen scream. Under magnification, the patterns revealed intention. Some fractures radiated out from a single impact point, the result of a heavy blow to the head. Others were small circular holes, perfectly shaped for flint or obsidian points travelling at high speed. In one skull, a stone arrowhead was still embedded in the bone, its edges worn smooth by thousands of years, but its purpose unmistakable. That arrow hadn't been shot for hunting. It had been aimed at a person. Forensic experts began sorting the injuries into categories: blunt force trauma, projectile wounds, parry fractures from raised arms trying to block attacks. They realized this wasn't a chaotic brawl or a predator attack. It was systematic, controlled. The blows came from different angles, suggesting multiple attackers striking at once. Some skulls showed 2 or 3 separate impacts, proof that victims were struck again even after they fell. Others had wounds to the back of the head, meaning they were running away. This wasn't just killing, it was extermination. The data became overwhelming. Out of 20, 7 skeletons, more than 2/3 had head trauma. Several had embedded stone flakes still in the ribs and pelvis. Even the children showed wounds that could only come from weapons. There were no signs of self, burial, or secondary disturbance, which meant the event happened quickly and the bodies were left where they fell. The scientists used 3-dimensional scans to recreate the sequence. The radial fracture lines in the skulls matched the impact power of stone, tipped clubs and projectiles travelling faster than a thrown spear. The evidence pointed to one terrible conclusion. This entire group had been wiped out in a single night. A massacre. When you look at the skulls lined up in the museum lab, it's impossible not to feel the weight of it. Each one was a person. Someone who had a name, a family, a small place beside the river where they cooked fish and watched the stars. Now their broken bones speak for them. They whisper the truth that no one wanted to believe. Violence isn't new. It didn't begin with kings or soldiers. It began here, among people who still made their tools from stone. And as scientists mapped every fracture and catalogued every piece of evidence, they realized something chilling. The same patterns of injury seen in these 12,000-year-old skulls are identical to those found on modern battlefields. Different weapons, same result. The story of that night was written in bone, and the bones never lie. Before the night of broken stars, life in the camp moved with the calm rhythm of routine. The sun hung low over the valley, painting the river in gold. Smoke drifted lazily from small hearths as families gathered to cook the day's catch. Fish racks lined the shore, their wooden poles darkened by years of use, hung with shimmering scales that caught the fading light. The air smelled of fire and water, and the faint sweetness of roasted roots. Children laughed near the shallows, skipping stones, their footprints pressed into the wet sand beside the marks of tools and baskets. It was a scene that could have been peaceful anywhere, in any age, and for a moment, it truly was. The people here were skilled survivors. They had learned to read the seasons by the colour of the sky and the taste of the wind. The men and women worked together, stripping reeds to weave mats, shaping flakes of stone into tools sharp enough to skin an antelope or carve wood for spears. Around one hearth, an elder mended a fishing net with patient fingers. Beside her, a young boy practiced fitting a new spear point, careful not to cut his hand. This was a place of rhythm and pattern, where every task had meaning. The women sorted through baskets of dried seeds and fruits collected from the nearby plains, while a few hunters returned from the ridge carrying bundles of meat wrapped in leaves. They moved easily through the camp, calling to one another, trading jokes and stories. They didn't know that their voices would be the last to echo in this place for 12,000 years. The ground beneath them held the memory of their daily lives, the ashes of their fires, the scatter of bones from past meals, the grooves worn into grinding stones from years of use. Archaeologists would one day trace these details and see the outline of a thriving community. Sleeping mats arranged in circles near the water's edge showed how the families positioned themselves close enough for safety, but with space for privacy. There were children's play traces, small collections of pebbles and animal bones arranged like tiny games, the kind of things that make you realize they weren't so different from us. As dusk settled, the camp came alive in the glow of the fires. Sparks rose into the air, drifting toward the darkening sky. People gathered in quiet groups, watching the light fade from the hills. The river murmured beside them, calm and steady. A woman hummed a low song as she rocked her child to sleep. The hunters sharpened their weapons out of habit, unaware how soon they would be needed. Beyond the trees, unseen eyes watched, but inside the camp there was no fear, only the easy rhythm of another day ending. The stars appeared, one by one, over the still water, and no one could have known that this would be their last peaceful night. 12,000 years ago, the world was changing in ways no one could fully understand. The ice that had blanketed the northern continents was melting, reshaping coastlines and flooding valleys, while other regions were drying out faster than life could adapt. Rivers that had once been wide and deep began to shrink into narrow channels. Lakes that had fed generations of hunters turned into cracked plains where only dust and bones remained. The people living along these fading waterways were caught between abundance and starvation. They followed the herds as they always had, but the herds were moving farther each season, chasing the last green patches of grass. Elephants, antelope, and wild cattle no longer returned to the same places. The rhythms that had guided life for centuries were breaking apart. Water was no longer just a source of life, it was a reason for conflict. Camps that once traded fish and tools began to see one another as competition. When the river ran low, people grew protective of their fishing spots. Strangers who approached were no longer greeted with curiosity, but with suspicion. Every drop mattered. Every patch of fertile ground was worth defending. Archaeologists studying this period can read it in the soil. Layers of dried clay and pollen reveal a sudden shift from lush wetland to brittle savanna. The signs of stress appear everywhere. Fewer animal bones in campsites. Smaller tools, designed to stretch resources further. Traces of burned vegetation, suggesting intentional fires to drive game or clear land. The environment itself was pushing humanity toward the edge. Imagine what it felt like to live through that transformation. You wake each morning to a sky that feels hotter than the day before. The air carries dust instead of moisture. The animals you depend on grow thinner. The rivers where your ancestors fished since time beyond memory now barely reach your knees. You move camp again and again, always hoping the next valley will be better. But everywhere you go, others are already there. They look at you with the same hunger in their eyes that you feel in your stomach. Cooperation becomes fragile. One mistake, one misunderstanding can turn neighbors into enemies. The world itself is forcing the first humans to learn what desperation means. Scientists call this time the Great Transition, when climate pushed small bands of people into closer contact, setting the stage for both culture and conflict. Scarcity created innovation, but it also created fear. Those who controlled water controlled survival. Those who guarded fertile ground became powerful. And for the first time in human history, survival wasn't just about endurance or skill. It was about territory. It was about defending what little the earth had left to give. In this tightening world, peace was no longer the natural state. It was a fragile pause before the next fight, and on one riverbank, under a sky filled with dust instead of rain, that fight was about to begin. When people think of war, they imagine metal swords and armor clashing in bright flashes of steel. But 12,000 years ago, there was no iron, no bronze, no forged weapons at all. Yet the people of that age knew how to kill with terrifying precision. Their tools were made of stone, wood, and fire, but in skilled hands they were as deadly as anything that came later. The first weapon was the club. Simple but brutally effective. Hunters learned early that the right piece of hardwood, shaped to fit the hand and weighted with a stone head, could crush a skull or break a limb in one strike. The best were hafted, meaning the stone was fixed to a handle using animal sinew and resin. The impact left wide fractures, the same kind that modern scientists still see on the skulls from the massacre site. A blunt weapon doesn't just break bone, it sends shockwaves through the body. It stuns, drops, and silences. But not everyone fought up close. The second weapon, the sling, turned distance into power. A strip of leather or woven fibre, a smooth river stone, and a practiced arm could turn a small rock into a projectile that hit with the speed of a modern bullet. Skilled slingers could strike a bird in flight or a person in the dark. A single sling stone could cave in a skull from 30 paces away. In a sudden night attack, it was the perfect first strike. Then there were the microliths, tiny blades chipped from volcanic glass or flint, sharp enough to cut flesh with barely any pressure. When fitted into wooden shafts, they became arrows or spears capable of piercing through skin and muscle with deadly precision. Some had barbed edges, so they could not be pulled out without tearing deep wounds. Others were coated in resin or ash to harden their tips in the fire before battle. These weren't crude inventions. They were the products of generations of experimentation. People had learned how to turn the materials of their world into tools for both survival and destruction. The fire-hardened spear was perhaps the most feared. It didn't need metal to kill. Hunters discovered that charring the tip of a wooden spear and scraping it to a point made it stronger than raw wood. A thrust with one of these could punch through a ribcage. It was the perfect weapon for both hunting and close combat. Every tool that fed them could also defend them. Every hunter could become a warrior when pushed to desperation. The evidence left behind tells the same story over and over again. Embedded arrowheads, crushed forearms raised in defense, clean punctures where spears found their mark. These weren't accidents. They were the scars of a deliberate act of war fought with nothing more than what nature provided. It proves that even before iron and bronze, the human imagination had already mastered the art of violence. The river that once gave life to both camps had become the line between survival and starvation. Along its banks, the reeds grew tall enough to hide a man standing upright. In their dry, whispering stalks, a group of hunters crouched low, faces streaked with mud to blend into the shadows. They had been watching for days. The camp across the water lived in patterns, and the scouts had learned every one of them. When the smoke rose from the morning fires, when the women went to the shallows to gather water, when the hunters left for the ridge to track gazelle, when the children played near the fish racks, every rhythm was recorded in silence. These men weren't strangers to the people they watched. They knew their faces, had traded with them seasons before, shared salt and stories when the world was still generous. But now the world was drying, and hunger had sharpened their thoughts into something harder. They no longer saw neighbours, only rivals guarding what should have been theirs. They moved slowly through the reeds, careful not to snap a stem or splash in the shallows. Each step was deliberate, rehearsed, almost ritual. Their leader raised a hand, signalling for them to freeze. He watched the camp through a gap in the reeds. The people were relaxed, unaware. Fires glowed softly. Laughter carried on the wind. The scouts counted the sleeping shelters, traced escape routes in their minds, studied where the waterline met the slope of the riverbank. They noted where the ground turned soft and where footprints collected. They were hunters mapping a kill zone, but this time the prey was human. When night fell, the reeds became their cover. The moon climbed high, silver light flickering off the ripples of the water. The scouts whispered quietly, deciding who would lead the first wave, who would circle to block the escape paths. Each man had a role. Some carried fire, hardened spears, others small slings and pouches of stones. They would strike fast and vanish before the camp could gather itself. It was not courage driving them, but necessity. Their own people were starving. The last of their waterholes had gone dry. They believed the river belonged to them, that taking it back was justice. As they waited for the signal to move, the air grew thick with the smell of mud and smoke. In the distance, a dog barked once and went quiet. The leader's hand closed around his spear. He could see the faint shapes of sleeping bodies beyond the flickering firelight. It was almost time. Somewhere inside him a voice whispered doubt, but hunger drowned it out. The reeds swayed gently as the wind shifted, carrying the scent of the camp toward them. The scouts inhaled slowly. They had memorized this smell, the smell of their enemies. Tomorrow, the reeds would be filled with echoes of shouts and blood, but for now, everything was silent. The night before the storm. The air was still that night, so still that every rustle of grass sounded like a whisper. The moon hung low over the valley, its pale light cutting faint paths across the river. The camp slept, unaware that in the reeds beyond the water, dozens of eyes watched their fires flicker. For hours the attackers had waited, their muscles stiff, their hands gripping weapons slick with sweat. They had rehearsed this moment, practiced it until the rhythm of it lived in their bones. They knew who would move first, who would follow, and where the first blow would fall. The signal would come in a sound that did not belong. It started softly, a single note rising out of the dark, the call of a bird that should not have sung at night. To the people in the camp it was nothing, just part of the night's music. But to the hunters hidden in the reeds, it was the spark. The leader lifted a torch from the mud, its light hidden by his hand. For a second it glowed between his fingers, then vanished. That flicker was the second signal. In the next heartbeat, everything moved at once. From the north side of the camp came the first rush. Feet pounded against the earth. Water splashed. The reeds erupted as figures charged forward. Stones whistled through the air, striking the sides of shelters. Spears followed, black silhouettes against the firelight. A woman screamed, jolting the camp awake. Men leapt to their feet, grabbing what they could, but confusion spread faster than understanding. From the opposite side, another wave came, perfectly timed. It was a circle closing. The attackers didn't shout or roar. They moved in silence, except for the impact of their weapons. The sound was sickening. A club against bone, a spear finding flesh. The smell of smoke thickened as a torch rolled into a mat and caught fire. The flames spread quickly, feeding on dry grass and oil from the fish racks. Panic turned to chaos. Children cried out. People stumbled in the smoke. Those who tried to flee toward the river found figures waiting there too. The plan had been perfect. No direction left open, no path to safety. The hunters had become soldiers without ever knowing the word. The signal that began as a single bird call had turned into a storm of movement, death sweeping through the camp in less than a minute. The only light now came from the burning shelters. Against the glow, the shadows looked inhuman, stretched long across the ground. The attackers struck quickly, efficiently, and then retreated just as fast. Within moments, silence returned. The bird call that started it all seemed to echo one last time across the water. The fires crackled, the reeds swayed, and the night closed back in as if nothing had happened. But on the riverbank, the story of that signal was already carved into bone, waiting for the world to rediscover it thousands of years later. It began with a sound no one could place, a faint whirring that sliced through the quiet like the buzz of an insect. Then another, then dozens more. Sling stones were flying, cutting through the night air so fast they hissed. The first struck a sleeping shelter with a dull crack, splitting the wood. Another hit a clay pot, shattering it into shards that scattered across the dirt. In the next instant, the sky seemed to rain stone. Arrows followed, small black streaks illuminated by the firelight as they arced over the camp. They came from every direction, thudding into the ground, the shelters, the bodies of those too slow to move. The rhythm of the attack was impossible to mistake. This wasn't chaos, it was precision. Every shot was meant to confuse and disorient, to turn the camp's peace into panic. People stumbled out of their shelters, half awake, ducking and shouting, clutching their children, not knowing where to run. The first to fall made no sound at all. A man near the fire dropped instantly, a stone buried deep in his temple. His body hit the ground with a heavy thud. Someone screamed, and the noise shattered whatever calm remained. Panic spread like fire through dry grass. Women grabbed what they could and ran toward the river, only to find more stones flying from that direction. Hunters reached for their spears, but the rain of projectiles made even standing up dangerous. Every few seconds came the hollow sound of impact, the sickening crack of bone against rock. The air was thick with dust and smoke. Embers from the fires rose and drifted, lighting the scene in flashes of orange and gold. Through the confusion, the attackers stayed hidden, crouched low in the dark beyond the camp's edge. They didn't need to rush in yet. Their weapons were doing the work for them. One of them swung his sling with smooth, practiced motion, releasing another stone that struck a woman in the shoulder, spinning her to the ground. The attack was relentless, each shot timed between the others, creating the illusion of hundreds of hands when there were only dozens. The defenders tried to shout orders, to rally together, but every voice was drowned by the roar of fear. The night was filled with the sounds of breaking wood, falling bodies, and the crack of stone meeting flesh. And just as suddenly as it began, the barrage stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. Smoke drifted low to the ground. The survivors gasped in the darkness, clutching their wounded, eyes darting for movement. They didn't know it yet, but the rain of stone had only been the beginning, a curtain of terror to shatter their order and leave them blind. From the reeds came the sound of movement again, soft and steady. And in that moment, those who remained realized the truth. The storm had ended, but the real killing was about to begin. The smoke hung low over the camp like a curtain, glowing faintly orange from the dying fires. The air was thick with the smell of ash and blood. Out of the haze, shapes began to move. The attackers were advancing now, stepping carefully over fallen shelters, weapons raised, eyes fixed on what was left of the camp. The defenders, shaken and bleeding, gathered near the center where the ground was open. There were no warriors here, only hunters, but they knew enough about survival to fight back. They formed a rough crescent around the last fire, spears pointed outward, children and wounded pushed behind them. Their breathing came fast and shallow, hearts pounding so hard it felt like thunder in their ears. One of the older hunters stepped forward, his face streaked with soot. He had seen this kind of ambush before, though never on this scale. He motioned for two younger men to spread out along the flank. They moved without speaking, crouching low, using the smoke as cover. For a few seconds, it looked like they might hold. The attackers slowed, cautious now. They knew desperation could make anyone dangerous. The first clash came quick. A spear jabbed out from the defender's line, striking a man in the leg. He fell, shouting, and the others hesitated. The older hunter used that pause, lunging forward with a wooden club, swinging hard. It connected with a sickening crack. The crowd of attackers surged, yelling now, their patience broken. They rushed in all at once. Spears and clubs met in a blur of motion. Every sound was raw and real, the grunt of effort, the gasp of pain, the thud of bodies hitting the ground. For a heartbeat, the defenders held their line. They fought not for victory but for time, time for their families to run, for someone to reach the trees or the river. One man feinted left, drawing an attacker in close, then drove his spear upward into the chest. Another turned a falling shelter into a barricade, swinging through the gaps like a trapped animal. But the attackers were too many. A stone struck the older hunter in the jaw, dropping him to his knees. A spear thrust followed. Fast and final, the crescent broke. The formation scattered as panic flooded back in. The survivors ran in every direction, tripping over the wounded, scrambling for anything that looked like cover. The attackers pressed forward, driving them toward the river, their voices rising in a wild chorus. The line that had held for only moments was gone. The hunters' courage had bought seconds, nothing more, but in those seconds, some managed to slip into the shadows. In the chaos, a few children disappeared into the reeds, unseen. The attackers didn't notice. They were still busy finishing what they had begun. The last light from the fire flickered across the trampled ground, and then the camp fell silent again, except for the sound of water and the faint echo of running feet fading into the dark. The river that had always promised safety now betrayed them. In the chaos of the attack, people ran blindly toward the sound of rushing water, thinking it meant escape. The moonlight shimmered on the surface, but it was deceptive. The ground between the camp and the water was slick with mud, churned by running feet. Those who reached it slipped instantly, falling hard, their hands sinking into the cold silt. The attackers were close behind, their footsteps pounding like drums. The first to reach the river tried to cross, splashing through the shallows. But the channel was deeper than it looked. The current was strong from the rains that had fallen days before. A woman carrying a child lost her footing. She screamed once before vanishing under the dark water. The child's small hand broke the surface for a heartbeat, then disappeared too. The others hesitated, trapped between the blades of their pursuers and the pull of the river. Someone shouted for them to move downstream where the water looked calmer, but in the panic no one listened. Spears flew through the air, striking the surface with dull splashes. One hit a man in the back as he tried to swim, and he collapsed forward, drifting away with the current. The river became a mirror for the horror above it, reflecting firelight, smoke, and the outlines of struggling bodies. From the far bank, the reeds whispered, hiding the shadows of more attackers who had already crossed earlier. The trap was complete. The survivors waded deeper, sinking into soft mud that clung to their legs like hands. The weight of their soaked clothing pulled them down. Every movement became slower, heavier. Behind them, the shouts grew louder, and the water turned red where bodies fell. The river bore silent witness to all of it. It carried the dead away, washing their blood into the wider world. The few who made it to the opposite bank were too weak to keep running. They collapsed among the reeds, gasping, shivering from shock and cold. One man dragged himself up the slope, clutching a wound in his side. He turned back and saw the camp in flames, the figures moving through the smoke, finishing what they had started. He would not survive the night, but for a brief moment he understood what had happened. This was not a raid for food or territory. It was erasure. The attackers were not taking what they needed. They were destroying everything that belonged to their rivals, so nothing could rise again. The river reflected the light of the burning camp, carrying ashes downstream. For centuries after, it would keep its secret, burying bones beneath layers of mud. sealing them in silence. But water remembers in its own way. The silt hardened over time, preserving every fracture, every wound, every story. And one day, long after the fire and fear were gone, the river would give up its witnesses, one skull at a time. The survivors who hadn't run to the river fell back toward the thorn enclosure, the protective wall they had built weeks earlier to keep out predators. It was meant for hyenas and wild dogs, not men with weapons, but it was all they had left. The wall was thick, woven from dried acacia branches that tore skin if touched. Inside, a handful of defenders gathered, their faces streaked with sweat and soot. They dragged the wounded in with them, pressing their backs to the barrier, clutching spears that were little more than sticks now. The fires outside cast a trembling glow through the thorns, each flicker of light making the shadows move like ghosts. Outside the enclosure, the attackers regrouped. Their leader watched the shapes inside and gave the order to wait. They had no need to rush. The camp was already burning, the air thick with heat. They began gathering burning branches, throwing them over the top of the barrier. Smoke poured inside, thick and bitter. The defenders coughed and covered their faces with their hands, eyes watering, lungs burning. The thorns crackled as the fire spread along the outer edge, small flames licking upward like orange snakes. A woman tried to smother the fire with wet hides, but it was useless. The smoke grew heavier until it was hard to see. The attackers then used hooks made from curved branches and bone to pull the wall apart. Each tug tore away another layer, opening small gaps through which they could thrust spears. The people inside fought back desperately. One man stabbed through a hole and hit something solid, pulling his spear back slick with blood. Another threw a stone that vanished into the smoke, followed by a sharp cry. For a moment it seemed like they could hold, but then the hooks tore open a wider section. Figures rushed through the gap, their bodies lit by firelight, their faces twisted with determination. The first clash was brutal and close. There was no room to swing, only to shove, stab, and fall. Sparks rained down as the barrier burned brighter. The ground was covered with embers that scorched bare feet. The smell of blood mixed with smoke until it was impossible to breathe without tasting it. One of the defenders managed to grab a flaming branch and swung it wildly, the fire lighting his face in bursts of orange. He screamed until his voice broke, but the attackers kept coming. They were not fighting for survival now, they were finishing what they had started. When the flames finally died, the enclosure was silent. The thorns had collapsed inward, blackened and brittle, their sharp ends curled like claws. The fire had consumed everything, even the bodies. The wind carried the last of the smoke toward the river, leaving behind nothing but scorched earth and a faint smell of ash. The last stand was over, and the night had claimed its victory. The dawn came quietly, as if afraid to touch the ground. The fires had burned out, leaving only thin threads of smoke drifting into the pale sky. The river was still, carrying pieces of ash that floated on its surface like tiny islands. The camp that had once been full of voices was now a graveyard. The attackers were gone, their tracks pressed deep into the mud, leading back toward the dry hills. What remained behind them was silence. A heavy, hollow silence that seemed to hang in the air. The bodies lay where they had fallen, tangled in the wreckage of the shelters. Some were half buried in ash, others sprawled across the riverbank, their limbs twisted as if still trying to run. The earth beneath them was dark with blood that had dried in the cool air of morning. The first light revealed everything: broken weapons, shattered pots, scattered beads from necklaces torn apart in the struggle. The air smelled of burnt wood and decay. If anyone had been left alive, they would have seen it as the sun rose, the full measure of what the night had taken. Scientists who later uncovered the site could read the violence in the bones. They found skulls fractured in perfect arcs where clubs had struck with brutal precision. Some skulls had 2 or 3 breaks, each from a separate hit. The cracks radiated outward like the lines of a spider web, proof that the blows came while the bone was still living. On the forearms of several skeletons, there were parry fractures, clean breaks from where the victims had raised their hands to block the attack. They had tried to protect themselves until the very end. Many of the bodies were found in small clusters, groups that had fallen together, families, perhaps, or people who had tried to shield one another. In one spot, a woman's bones were found curled around the tiny skeleton of a child. The scientists who examined them could tell she had turned her body to protect it. The child's skull was intact. Hers was not. The silence after that night lasted thousands of years, buried beneath layers of river mud. But the evidence was patient. Every broken bone was a record. Every fragment of flint lodged in a rib or spine was a sentence in the story of the world's first recorded massacre. The light of that dawn froze the moment forever. No one came to bury the dead. No one sang or prayed over them. The attackers had left them as a warning, a message written in the stillness of morning. The camp would never be rebuilt. The fires would never be lit again. As the sun climbed higher, the wind began to move through the reeds, whispering over the water. It was the only sound left, soft and unending, like the river counting the silence of the fallen. When the moon rose again, the valley was quiet except for the soft lap of water against the shore. From the hills, a few figures appeared, moving cautiously through the reeds. They were not warriors. They were kin. Word of the massacre had spread like smoke carried on the wind. Nearby camps had seen the glow of the fires days earlier, the black column rising into the night sky, and they came now to see what remained. They found the camp in ruin, the air heavy with the smell of death. For a long time, no one spoke. They moved through the wreckage slowly, stepping over burned shelters and broken tools, their faces lit only by the faint light of the moon. Some called out names into the darkness, voices trembling, hoping to hear an answer. None came. The survivors who had escaped the attack were the ones who led them. They showed where the bodies lay, pointing out friends, siblings, and children. There was no time for ceremony, no songs or long prayers. The smell of decay warned them that animals would come soon, drawn by what the attackers had left behind. They worked quickly, digging shallow pits with their hands and with the same tools the dead had used for hunting and fishing. The ground near the river was soft, the clay damp and cold. Each time they struck it, the sound echoed through the still air. They arranged the bodies carefully, not in perfect order, but with intention. Families together, elders near the young. Some wrapped in hides or mats that had escaped the flames. Others laid bare beneath the open sky. The survivors wiped soot from faces, closed eyes, straightened limbs. It was all they could do. The moonlight shimmered on the surface of the river as they worked. The same water that had witnessed the slaughter now reflected their quiet labour. They covered each body with layers of earth and clay, pressing it down gently, sealing wounds and memory alike. For a brief moment, the camp came alive again with whispered voices and the sound of hands moving dirt. A woman sang softly to herself as she buried her husband. Her song had no words, only rhythm, rising and falling with her breath. It was the kind of song meant not for the living but for the land, a way of telling the earth to hold the dead carefully. When the last grave was covered, they marked the site with stones taken from the riverbank. Simple, unshaped stones, placed in small circles so they could find it again if they ever returned. Before leaving, one of the men pressed his hand into the wet clay, leaving a print beside the largest grave. The The mark remained there long after the people were gone, long after the river rose and fell again. It was a promise written in silence, a vow that the fallen would not be forgotten, even when the world moved on and the moon no longer remembered their names. No war ever begins in a single night. It builds slowly, one small spark at a time, until someone finally strikes the match. For the people who lived along that ancient river, life had become a careful balance between need and pride. The water was everything. It gave them fish, clay, reeds, and cool places to camp when the heat of the plains became too much. But it also gave them conflict. The fishing weirs that dotted the river were more than tools. They were lifelines. Wooden fences woven across shallow sections trapped schools of fish during migration. Whoever controlled those traps controlled survival. At first, the groups shared them, trading dried fish for stone blades or meat from hunts farther inland. But as the seasons grew harsher and the river thinned, the catches became smaller. The sharing stopped. Each group began claiming certain stretches of water as their own, setting markers, warning outsiders to stay away. A single crossing at the wrong place could start a fight. One story, told through the bones and broken tools, suggests it may have begun with theft. A cache of dried fish and smoked meat taken from one camp while its hunters were away. In an age where every mouthful counted, it was more than stealing food. It was stealing survival. The victims likely tracked the thieves, following prints in the mud, finding scraps of their own baskets among another tribe's belongings. Words were exchanged. Spears were raised. Someone was killed. Revenge became a new kind of hunger, passed from one season to the next. Archaeologists studying the site found evidence of repeated visits between the groups long before the massacre. They traded shells, pigments, and crafted tools. But those same paths used for trade became roads for war. It was not just about food anymore. It was about status. In early human societies, survival wasn't the only measure of power. The ability to protect or take resources made a leader. It shaped alliances and marriages. Control of the river meant prestige, and prestige meant security. If one group felt disrespected or wronged, they couldn't ignore it without appearing weak. A single insult could ripple through generations. So when the ambush came, it wasn't just revenge. It was a message to everyone who watched that the river belonged to those strong enough to defend it. Prestige had become a kind of currency, and violence was the cost of keeping it. By the time the attack began, the reasons had already blurred. Maybe some of the attackers no longer remembered the original theft or the argument that started it all. Maybe they were only following orders or protecting what they thought was theirs. The motives had layered like the silt at the bottom of the river, one story buried beneath another until all that remained were broken bones and silence. In the end, no one really won. The river flowed on, washing away the blood of both sides, carrying their legacy not in victory, but in memory. Long before cities and borders, the river was the only map anyone needed. It wound through valleys and open plains, feeding dozens of camps scattered along its banks. Each group had its own stretch of land, its own hunting paths, and its own fishing spots. But none of them lived in isolation. The river connected them all, a moving thread stitching their lives together. During the wet season, when the rains filled the channels and the fish were plentiful, the camps traded and travelled freely. People moved in long circuits, carrying baskets of dried meat, flint tools, and colourful shells from one camp to another. Each visit renewed bonds of friendship and exchange. Marriages were arranged between groups to strengthen alliances. A new tool design might spread hundreds of miles this way, carried in the hands of travellers who told stories beside the fires of strangers. It was a network built on trust, but trust was fragile. The dry season changed everything. As the river shrank, its banks grew crowded. Camps that had once been a day's walk apart now found themselves competing for the same pools of water and the same herds. Old friendships cracked under the weight of hunger. People remembered every small betrayal, every unfair trade, every stolen catch. The same paths that had carried gifts now carried spies. In some seasons, the same people who shared food in one camp would face each other with weapons in another. The web that had once united them became a trap of shifting loyalties. Archaeologists studying the region found traces of this delicate system written in the soil. Different types of stone tools showed how far people travelled, each material marking a connection to another group upriver or downriver. Some tools came from quarries hundreds of miles away, proof of alliances that reached beyond what anyone imagined for hunter-gatherers. But alongside the evidence of trade lay signs of tension. Charred campsites built over older ones showed that territories changed hands often, sometimes peacefully, sometimes not. It was a world where cooperation and competition lived side by side, where every handshake carried a hint of caution. When one group grew too strong, others joined together to balance the power. The river corridor worked like a living organism, constantly adapting, growing, and breaking apart again. Those who navigated its politics well thrived. Those who didn't vanished, their camps reclaimed by reeds and time. The massacre site wasn't an isolated tragedy. It was part of this larger story, the result of threads pulled too tight in a web stretched across generations. The same river that had given birth to connection had also given birth to conflict. It reminded every camp that survival depended not just on food and water, but on knowing when to trust and when to strike first. In a world held together by fragile promises, one mistake could turn an ally into an enemy overnight. When the smoke cleared and the fires burned down to ash, the valley fell silent. Days later, small groups of travellers began to arrive, drawn by the smell of burnt wood and the sudden absence of familiar voices. Among the ruins they found the unthinkable, a handful of children still alive. They were weak, hungry, covered in soot, and too shocked to speak. Some had hidden in the reeds during the attack. Others had crawled beneath broken shelters and stayed there until the noise stopped. The adults who found them understood immediately what had happened. The camp was gone, its people wiped out. The children were the only link left to a community that no longer existed. They carried them away in silence, walking for hours along the river, their small hands gripping the belts and arms of their rescuers. These children would grow up far from the place they were born, raised by distant kin or allied groups who took them in. But survival came at a cost. Every adult lost in the massacre meant a lifetime of skills erased. The people of that time didn't have books or tools to record their knowledge. Everything they knew about fishing, hunting, fire-making, and medicine existed only in memory. When memory died, so did the skill. The children would never learn the exact songs their mothers sang while weaving nets, or the right season to harvest roots from the riverbank. They would inherit fragments of their world, but never the whole. Archaeologists call this kind of loss a knowledge bottleneck, a moment when culture shrinks along with population. You can see it in the artifacts left behind after such events. Simpler tools, fewer styles, traditions that suddenly stop appearing in the record. It's not that people forgot how to create, but that the teachers were gone. The survivors had to start over with less. The children who grew up after the massacre became the first generation of rebuilders. They learned what they could from those who remained, mixing old customs with new ones borrowed from neighbouring groups. Slowly, their identity changed. The language of their parents may have faded, replaced by the dialect of their rescuers, their hunting techniques adapted to different lands. In time, they may not have even remembered the valley where they were born, but deep in their stories, passed on by word of mouth, the memory of loss survived. Around fires, elders spoke of a camp by the river that was destroyed in a single night, of a people who vanished. The children left behind would become the living bridge between what was lost and what endured. Their survival meant that the story did not end completely. It changed shape, carried forward in whispers and fragments, buried in the rhythm of new songs. Even after the last traces of the camp disappeared under layers of silt, the memory of its fall lived on in the blood of those children, the quiet witnesses of humanity's oldest tragedy. Long after the massacre faded into legend, its scars remained etched in the bones of those who came after. Archaeologists studying nearby burial sites found signs of survival written not in words but in healed wounds. Skulls with fractures that had mended, arms that had once been broken and grown strong again, ribs fused where spears had pierced them years earlier. These were the lucky ones, the ones who lived through smaller raids and fights in the generations that followed. Their bones told stories of a world where danger never fully disappeared. Even when peace returned to the valley, fear lingered like a shadow. People began changing the way they lived, the way they looked, even the way they marked their own bodies. Scarification, once used mainly for beauty or ceremony, took on new meaning. Deep cuts carved into the skin, filled with ash to leave raised scars, became more than decoration. They became symbols of endurance and belonging. Each mark told others who you were, what group you came from, and whether you could be trusted. For the first time, identity was not only spoken, but carved into flesh. Those patterns of scars have been found preserved on ancient remains, tiny ridges still visible after thousands of years. They are the first human tattoos of survival. The beadwork changed too. Earlier generations favoured bright, delicate shells strung into long necklaces, signs of trade and wealth. But after the age of violence began, those designs grew simpler, heavier, and more practical. People began wearing shorter strands that would not catch while running or fighting. The patterns became less about beauty and more about unity. A shared design meant safety, a signal that you belonged to a larger network. Archaeologists have noticed how this shift appears across sites along the river corridor, a cultural fingerprint left by fear and adaptation. Even the tools people made reflected the tension of the times. Spears were refined, easier to repair. Arrowheads became sharper, lighter, designed to be carried in large numbers. Fire pits were built closer together, suggesting that groups slept more tightly packed for protection. The changes were subtle, but they spoke of a world constantly watching the horizon, waiting for another attack that might never come. Yet within that fear was resilience. Every healed fracture proved that survival was possible. Every scar told a story of someone who refused to die. The people of the valley learned to turn pain into memory, memory into strength. When the storms passed and the river filled again, they rebuilt, but not as they had before. They carried the lessons of violence in their bodies, their art, and their traditions. The marks endured long after the reason for them was forgotten. In the end, they became part of who they were, proof that even in a world shaped by fear, humanity always finds a way to create meaning out of pain. The stones that once killed now speak louder than words. Scattered through the soil around the old camp, archaeologists began finding weapon fragments that told their own version of the story. Tiny arrowheads chipped from volcanic glass, spears tipped with fine, grained quartzite, flakes of chert so sharp they could still cut skin after thousands of years. Each piece carried clues not only about how it was made, but where it came from. By studying the minerals within the stone, scientists traced their origins to distant quarries, some over 100 miles away. That distance meant one thing: whoever fought here was not local. They had travelled far, maybe following the river downstream, moving through other territories before striking this one. The battle had not been random. It was planned, the result of a long journey and careful preparation. The weapons themselves showed the rhythm of that life, under microscopes where marks revealed the habits of their makers. Some points had been sharpened again and again, their edges uneven from repeated use. Each time a hunter or warrior retouched the edge, they left behind a story of return. You could almost see the pattern. A long trip, a fight, a retreat, then another trip back to the same quarry to gather new stone. The cycle of violence was not just emotional, it was physical, written into the tools. Archaeologists could tell that some of the arrowheads had been reworked from older tools. Blades once used for cutting meat or scraping hides, now reshaped into weapons. It was recycling born of necessity, proof that even after years of conflict, people adapted to scarcity. Every piece of stone was valuable. Even broken tips found their way into new weapons, bound with sinew and resin, ready to be used again. This wasn't just survival, it was strategy. The attackers knew how to fight with precision and conserve their resources. In a world where every tool had to be made by hand, waste was a luxury no one could afford. The variety of materials found at the site showed how wide their networks had become. Some of the obsidian came from highlands far to the east, others from the rocky plains of the west. Each trade route, each migration path, left behind traces of contact. It meant that these early people were not isolated tribes, but participants in a vast and shifting web of alliances. Every flake of stone was a thread in that network. The weapons were not just instruments of death, they were artifacts of connection, proof of movement and communication. The edges that once ended lives now reveal how deeply intertwined those lives were. When scientists hold these points today, they are holding stories of raids and returns, of hands that shaped and reshaped the same blades through years of conflict. Each mark, each scratch, is a record of endurance. The stones remember what people forgot. They remember who fought, where they came from, and how far they were willing to go to defend what they called home. For a long time, the massacre was just a story told by bones and broken tools, but modern science gave it a clock. To understand when it happened, archaeologists needed to do more than study the violence. They had to date the night itself. The layers of soil became their calendar. Each band of sediment along the riverbank recorded a different chapter of time. The deeper they dug, the older the story. The layer where the bodies lay was sealed beneath a thick band of river silt, smooth and undisturbed, which meant the flood had buried everything soon after the attack. Nothing had been moved, nothing added. The camp had been frozen in place by the river's own hand. Radiocarbon dating came first. Fragments of burned wood from the shelters and pieces of bone still rich in organic carbon were analysed. The results pointed to a window around 13,000 years ago, near the end of the last ice age. It was a time when the world was shifting. Glaciers were retreating, rivers were changing course, and human populations were adjusting to new landscapes. But radiocarbon alone wasn't enough. To confirm the age, scientists used a second method called optically stimulated luminescence, or OSL. It measures the last time grains of sand were exposed to sunlight before being buried. When the flood covered the camp, the sand grains trapped a faint charge from that moment. By reading that charge, researchers could tell how long they had been hidden. The results matched perfectly with the radiocarbon data. The two clocks, one organic and one mineral, ticked in unison. Stratigraphy told the rest of the story. Above the burial layer, there were no signs of rebuilding, no later occupation. That absence was proof that the massacre had ended the settlement completely. The camp was never reoccupied, only sealed away by time. But the real confirmation came from the bones themselves. When scientists studied the pattern of injuries, they found something chilling. Every wound had occurred while the victims were still alive, or moments before death. The fractures were fresh, the breaks clean. There were no signs of healing, no evidence of sickness or starvation. This was not a population worn down by disease or slow decline. It was a group of healthy people struck down all at once. The trauma clustering told the truth. Dozens of individuals killed in a narrow window of time, their bodies falling together, their weapons still in hand. Using the minimum number of individuals method, or MNI, scientists confirmed that at least 27 people died that night, though the real number was likely higher. Together, the data formed a perfect alignment. Radiocarbon, OSL, stratigraphy, trauma, and MNI all pointed to the same moment in deep history. A single night when peace ended in violence. It was not centuries of warfare or scattered raids. It was one catastrophic event, one eruption of human rage that turned a quiet riverside camp into the earliest battlefield we have ever found. The bones and tools did not just reveal a massacre, they revealed a plan. Nothing about the attack on the river camp was random. It was the product of minds that understood patience, movement, and fear. Archaeologists studying the site found clues that turned a tragedy into a tactical map. The first sign was the direction of the projectiles. The stones and arrows that rained down on the camp had come from multiple angles at once. The attackers had divided into groups, spreading out across the terrain so that no escape route was safe. This meant coordination, not chaos. It meant that before the first strike, they had studied the layout of the camp, learning where the fires burned at night, where people slept, and which paths led to the river. They had probably hidden nearby for days, watching the rhythms of life, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Their timing was precise. The first barrage came in the darkest hour before dawn, when the fires had burned low and most of the camp was asleep. By attacking from all sides, they created confusion, making it impossible for the defenders to know where to focus their defense. This was not the kind of brawl common among early bands of foragers. It was organized warfare, the earliest kind of military doctrine, built from experience and necessity. The attackers likely used decoys too. Some evidence suggests that sounds were used to draw attention, a call from one direction while the main force approached from another. A single bird cry, repeated just before the first stones flew, became a signal to move. Those same tactics appear in later prehistoric conflicts, proof that the logic of ambush has ancient roots. Even the logistics of the operation were remarkable, moving dozens of fighters through tall grass and reeds without alerting the camp required discipline. They would have carried their weapons bundled to keep them silent, wrapped in hide or reeds to muffle the sound of stone against stone. Their feet would have been bare or bound with soft fibers. Every movement practiced until it was second nature. They had to communicate without speaking, using hand signs and gestures, reading each other's eyes in the dim light. The success of the encirclement shows how deeply they understood terrain. The attackers used the river as both a barrier and a trap, driving their victims toward it with volleys of projectiles, knowing that panic would make them run in the only direction that led to open water. There was no retreat, only drowning or capture. It was a level of tactical thinking far beyond what most people imagine for the Stone Age. It shows that the roots of strategy, deception, and coordination stretch back to the very beginning of human conflict. These were not mindless hunters turned violent. They were planners, tacticians of the Pale Front, whose understanding of silence, surprise, and fear turned a quiet night into the first recorded act of total war. The massacre by the river was not an isolated tragedy. Far from it. As archaeologists began to uncover other sites from the same era, a pattern started to appear, like echoes of violence carried across time and distance. Each site told the same quiet story of fear, survival, and human intent. On another river hundreds of miles away, a team found a cluster of skeletons buried together in shallow graves. Every skull showed signs of trauma, the same clean fractures caused by blunt weapons. Arrowheads were still lodged in ribs and spines. The victims had fallen side by side, their final moments frozen in the soil. Radiocarbon dating placed the event at roughly the same period as the first massacre. Different valley, same signature. In a lakeshore settlement discovered years later, the same clues appeared again. Projectile points made from foreign stone, suggesting attackers who had travelled far to reach their target. Burned shelters. Parry fractures on forearms. The marks of a community caught in the middle of the night by people who knew how to strike fast and disappear. Across the ancient world, from the grasslands of Africa to the floodplains of Europe, the record began to show a rhythm of recurring violence. Before, scientists had believed large-scale warfare was a symptom of farming, that conflict grew out of property, crops, and territory. But these forager sites told another story. The roots of war were older than agriculture, older than walls and kings. They began when survival and status collided along the same rivers that sustained life. Each discovery mirrored the next. At one site, skulls showed healed wounds alongside fatal ones, proof that survivors carried the memory of earlier attacks for years before dying in another. At another site, weapons made from exotic materials hinted at raids planned across vast distances, just like those at the river camp. Even the placement of bodies followed a familiar pattern, clustered together in small groups as if struck down while protecting one another. The more scientists compared, the clearer the picture became. This was not chaos, but a way of life, shaped by constant tension. The same kind of strategy, the same tools, the same fear. The forager world had its own politics, its own fragile networks of trust. And when those networks broke, the result was always the same. Camps burned, rivers ran red, and generations carried scars in both body and memory. These sites form a grim map of early human violence, but they also reveal something deeper. Wherever conflict appeared, so did adaptation. After every massacre came change, new defenses, new alliances, new rituals of protection. Humanity did not invent war once. It rediscovered it again and again, each time in a different landscape but with the same logic. The echoes across these shores remind us that the instinct to organize, to plan, to dominate, and to resist is as ancient as language itself. The rivers may have changed course, but the sound of those first battles still ripples beneath the surface of our history. The memory of the massacre did not fade. It reshaped everything that came after. The people who survived and those who heard the stories began to live differently. Fear became the architect of new ideas. Across the river valleys, camps changed shape. Instead of spreading wide and open, they began to cluster in tight circles. Sleeping mats were arranged in rings with the fires at the center so no one would face the darkness alone. The outer ring was lined with thorns, sharpened stakes, and heavy stones that could be rolled quickly to block entrances. It was not a wall in the way cities would one day build them, but it was the first hint of fortification born from instinct. Night no longer belonged to rest. It became a time of vigilance. Groups began to establish watch cycles, pairs of sentinels who stayed awake through the dark hours while the others slept. They learned to read the sounds of the night, to know which calls belonged to animals and which came from people hiding in the reeds. Their hearing became sharper, their sense of time measured by the changing of the stars. Even the children learned that sleep was no longer a guarantee of safety. But fear alone was not enough to survive. People also learned to prevent war before it started. They invented rituals to cool hot blood, small acts of diplomacy that let anger fade before it turned to violence. When groups met at the river to trade or fish, they began using signal codes. A sequence of bird calls or rhythmic claps meant peace. A smoke column rising straight up meant the same. It was an early language of truce, one that let strangers announce their intentions before coming close. Meetings took place in neutral zones, open spaces between territories where both sides could see one another clearly. No one brought weapons into the center. Hands were shown, palms up, to prove trust. Food was shared, songs were exchanged, and disputes were settled with gifts instead of blows. These new frameworks turned survival into structure. What had once been instinct slowly became culture. The memory of fear gave rise to rules and customs that kept people alive. Some of these rituals lasted for thousands of years, passed down and reshaped by generations that no longer remembered where they began. Archaeologists can see traces of them in artifacts that show shared design between rival groups, proof that cooperation eventually replaced bloodshed. The forager world learned that peace required effort, constant and deliberate. It was not the absence of fear, but its management. Every watchfire, every signal, every cautious greeting was part of a fragile balance built from the ashes of the massacre. Out of terror came order, and from order came the first fragile foundations of what would one day become society. When scientists lifted the first skull from the mud, they were not just uncovering the bones of a person, they were uncovering a memory written in the oldest language humanity knows, the language of survival. The fractures, the embedded stones, the scattered beads, all told a story older than history itself. A single night of violence, frozen in time, its echo stretching across the ages. It was proof that even before villages or kingdoms, people already knew what it meant to fight, to fear, and to lose. But it was also proof of something greater. That same night of terror became the seed of everything that would follow. Cooperation, justice, the idea of right and wrong, all began here, born out of the lessons left in shattered bone. When those early communities saw what war could do, they began to change. They built tighter camps, watched the horizon, and learned to settle disputes with ritual and reason instead of blood. They learned that one person's safety depended on everyone else's, that the group had to act as one or none would survive. It was the beginning of a truth that still shapes us now, that the instinct for violence and the need for peace are twins born from the same moment in time. Every scar on those skulls carries a message about who we became. The people who died by the river were not so different from us. They laughed, hunted, raised children, and told stories beside the fire. Their killers, too, were not monsters, just humans caught in the endless cycle of need and fear. What divides the two is not morality, but memory. We remember them because they left evidence of what happens when community fails, and in that memory, we find the origins of law. Long before written codes or courts, the idea of consequence was carved into human thought by nights like that one. The survivors understood that unchecked anger could destroy everything. They passed down warnings in songs and myths, teaching future generations how to recognize the signs of danger before it was too late. Over time, those teachings became customs, then rules, then systems of justice meant to keep the peace that their ancestors had died for. The river where the massacre happened still winds through its valley today, quiet and unassuming, its waters carrying the sediment of centuries. Beneath its banks lie the remains of those who lived and died in that forgotten conflict. The river remembers, even if we nearly forgot. It has witnessed humanity's worst moments and our first steps toward understanding ourselves. The skulls are not relics of savagery, but mirrors reflecting the earliest struggles that shaped what it means to be human. They remind us that civilization was not born in triumph, but in mourning, that out of loss came order, and from fear came unity. The river keeps flowing, the bones keep speaking, and the story they tell is the oldest one we know. We survived because we learned.